So, in April 2023, it was announced that a full-fledged Harry Potter reboot was officially in the works. Not a new theme park attraction, experimental stage play, not even a half-baked spin-off franchise. We're talking the real-deal original story produced in live action by HBO with the direct oversight of J.K. Rowling. A decade-spanning project slated to faithfully adapt each iconic book into a season of premium cinematic streaming content. And so the fans went crazy. I'm not so sure how true that last part is, though, at least not to what extent, but I would hesitate to call it the full story. I think I speak for a sizable contingent of the target audience when I say that my reaction was a notably unenthusiastic already. Because we all knew this was coming, it was always only a matter of time, but by a wide margin there is no precedent for an IP this commercially successful being rebooted this shamelessly early. The multi-billion-dollar elephant in the room is that we already got what was ostensibly the definitive adaptation as far as anyone on the production or consumer side was concerned. A new live-action series is not going to feel like a highly anticipated adaptation of the books nearly as much as it's going to feel like they are functionally remaking one of the most successful and culturally significant film series we've ever seen, barely a full decade after it was finished. For that reason, I can't help but feel like this project has more heavy lifting to do in order to justify its own existence than any piece of entertainment media maybe ever. The official video announcement is a bare-bones teaser with basic iMovie-style text on screen set to John Williams' classic Hedwig's theme from the original movies. That decision, while understandable, is a sort of preemptive microcosm of the dilemma that producers will find themselves in throughout nearly every facet of this new project. When you want to tease a well-known franchise release to drum up hype but don't have a proof of concept yet, don't have anything to show for that matter, what do? You could use some of the most instantly recognizable artistry already associated with that brand that you can get away with and let it do the legwork. And why wouldn't they take advantage of this score? The intrigue and nostalgia it draws with just a few simple notes is the type of marketing that even money can't buy. It's perfect the way it is. The only thing it is not is part of this new project. Historically, any media that fell under the wider umbrella of Wizarding World shared a singular brand identity and coexisted, at least in theory, within the same universe. For the first time, that isn't the case anymore. By choosing to recreate the original rather than expanding on it, this reboot is intentionally removing itself from that established iteration of the story. At some point, it will presumably compose its own theme. But ask yourself, will that melody effectively convey what the original does within this context? No, of course not. No one would associate it with Harry Potter yet. Would it be better? That's technically subjective, and call me cynical, but no. An unlikely best case scenario would be something as good as, though still less recognizable or iconic than the original, at least for now. Therein lies the catch-22. Do you use something at best on par, though in all likelihood marginally worse than the original? In which case, why does this reboot need to exist? Or do you simply recycle the existing theme from the original, the property that this show will be endlessly compared to no matter what? In which case, again, why does this reboot exist? So I'm skeptical, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't think this is a good idea, and I want to talk about why.
What do you mean?
You know perfectly well what I mean.
There are several different angles I'll be coming at this from, so let's just go ahead and get this one out of the way early, because while highly relevant here, there just isn't a ton that hasn't already been beaten to death about superhero fatigue or reboot fatigue. The idea that a lack of originality has started to ruin entertainment is not exactly a hot take. Some people think the concept is overblown and just advocate for quality over quantity regardless, but the overall consensus appears to be at least some level of acknowledgement that Hollywood is becoming more lazy and risk-averse in its reliance on established IPs. It seems like almost every new title with even a modestly ambitious marketing budget these days is a kind of ESPN 8 The Ocho version of something, anything with pre-existing brand recognition. Beyond the repetitive nature, endless sequels can cheapen the impact of the original. A multiverse can obfuscate and diminish the stakes within its own storytelling framework. And while plenty of these releases turn out fine, a much larger percentage have started to feel like forgettable, AI-generated slop, if not outright parodies of themselves. In a way, we've gotten much closer to a sort of equilibrium where the same brand recognition that used to guarantee butts and seats will now come across as a red flag because of how likely it is to indicate uninspired storytelling that only exists as an easy cash grab. Audiences are mirroring that corporate risk aversion in response to what they now have good reason to be distrustful of from the major production studios. I don't want to sit here and pretend that Harry Potter doesn't carry enough draw to cut through the noise, but it does make you wonder how much audience demand they're taking for granted here amidst the million other things we're expected to pay attention to.
I didn't ask for this to happen.
Reimagining older classics for a new generation of audience is just part of entertainment. It's nothing new and not inherently a bad idea. Starting fresh does make a ton of sense for certain IPs, but Reboot typically implies an admission that the first go-around fell publicly short of expectations in some way by contemporary standards. Hard reboots of recent releases are best suited for properties with disastrous or even just underwhelming first adaptations that left the on-screen story unsatisfying or incomplete. A big contributor to that franchise fatigue is that if we look at some noteworthy case studies, it's a bit hit or miss with the track record. That's true even of popular titles on the big streaming giants, including content from HBO, which isn't much reassurance. With examples, it's hard not to consider Avatar: The Last Airbender. The animated series premiered on Nickelodeon in 2005, which was during both the book and movie run for Harry Potter's original release. It resonated with a similar demographic of young people who grew up with a soft spot for the show, but can also revisit it with an even deeper appreciation as an adult. It was similarly praised for great character dynamics and exploring rich, often heavy or mature themes in a wholesome way.
Then, everything changed
When they made a live-action movie, 2010's The Last Airbender is an enigma of incompetence, legitimately one of the worst movies ever made. M. Night Shyamalan, of all people, was writer, producer, and director, clearly too much creative control for such a strange choice. He'd made a name for himself primarily in lower and mid-budget psychological thrillers, but by this point was already steadily trending down toward a career low point. There are much more thorough reviews on YouTube, but this was unanimously hated, and any future plans quickly scrapped. A live-action reboot series debuted on Netflix just this year and was recently greenlit for the remaining seasons 2 and 3. It's been received somewhat well, obviously surpassing the movie and even expanding on the original in a couple of ways, but you just don't see much of anyone who would honestly claim that it matches the heights of the animated version. There's so little to be improved upon there, particularly in what they were able to accomplish visually. Netflix Avatar looks impressive, if a bit artificial, but so much of the heart and tone of the original is explicitly thanks to the vibrant 2D animation. So for many people, it'll always be a bit hard to call this one a success. Percy Jackson, from what little I know, seems more than fair to call derivative of Harry Potter, even going as far as to hire on Chris Columbus to direct its debut. Those two cinematic adaptations were relative disappointments, neither crack 500 on the big review sites. They were criticized for departing from the source material, the author disavows them, and the on-screen series fizzled out from there. A Disney Plus reboot is currently running, getting less buzz than Avatar, but I think fans are just happy to finally have something respectable on screen, so it seems to be doing well enough. The kind of obvious gold standard right now would have to go to Dune. It's got both a genuine lifelong fan of the source material and a proven visionary director within that genre at the helm, and it shows. Parts 1 and 2 overachieved critically and at the box office, but more importantly outclassed their 1984 predecessor by far. The influential but flawed Lynch adaptation suffered significantly from the technological limitations of its time, and had for the most part fallen out of the mainstream in the roughly 4 decades since. Neither of which are the case for Harry Potter, so with that in mind, let's look at what we know so far. Francesca Gardner was just announced as showrunner and screenwriter. She's got credits on Succession, which is definitely promising. Probably most relevant here, though, is her work on HBO's adaptation of the trilogy His Dark Materials. It's another British book series in the supernatural parallel universe realm from back in the Harry Potter era. It did fly more under the radar here in America, but had a short-lived movie series attempt that left a lot to be desired. This show is solid, though. Daphne Keene's a good Lyra in particular, and some of the visuals are a standout for television. And if you're familiar with the books, HBO's Reboot is also about as faithful an adaptation as you'll get for a story this high concept. There are a few odd casting choices, and the more contemporary aesthetic in certain settings doesn't always work for me personally, but I would recommend it if you're curious about this new Harry Potter reboot. And while the more vocally opinionated crowd obviously is, I do wonder how much a good portion of the fans are feeling something closer to passively checked out.
You all right, Harry? Seem very quiet.
It's no secret that the HP brand name's a bit past its prime. That does feel silly to say though, right? It's obviously still worth a fortune, it prints money without any new releases, but when you were on top of the world for as long as this series was, there's only one direction left to go. And that reputational decline has been gradual and messy in ways that feel deserving of a dedicated autopsy to put things in context, so we'll do that now. About a decade and a half ago, Harry Potter was almost inarguably considered the most universally beloved modern classic of the new millennium, but as a consequence, made too many people way too much money to be left well enough alone. This hype was about to seal the brand's fate to overstay its welcome while being milked for all it's worth. The Cursed Child, despite being a genuinely fantastic, award-winning stage production, was based on what can only be described as an elaborate and truly bizarre time travel fanfiction with a plot that was polarizing at best. It was immediately obvious that this script was something Rowling had no direct involvement in writing, but had instead given her blessing to in a sort of supervisory role. As the first official entry into the franchise after the original story was finished, a stage play set immediately at the epilogue was a major format break, and an ambitious one at that. I won't bother breaking down the plot in detail, both because it's so convoluted I don't think I could, and if you're not familiar with it already, you probably wouldn't even believe me if I tried. What matters is that none of the characters act recognizably like themselves, countless plot beats directly contradict established rules and lore from the original, and the play is much more concerned with recycling old material for nostalgia's sake through the gimmick of time travel than creating much of anything new. However, this mostly inconsequential fever dream speedrun through Harry's world made The Cursed Child feel more like a theme park ride than a new story with real implications to the canon. And since the accessibility is so limited by the medium of live theater as opposed to something anyone could consume on demand, as a self-contained Harry Potter experience, it almost works to just give the awful plot a pass and let this weird little spin-off be what it is. But the inexcusable part of this whole mess was releasing full-price physical copies of the rough script and stage notes in their existing format alongside a marketing campaign dishonestly calling it the 8th Harry Potter book, when that is not and was never meant to be what this actually is. Audiences rightfully felt misled and taken advantage of by a shameless cash grab from what was already one of the most profitable entertainment franchises in the business. But the long-term damage this dealt to the wider Harry Potter brand is, I think, best examined through the precedent that The Cursed Child set going forward. For the first time ever, J.K. Rowling signing her name off on a new project no longer meant what it always had up until that point. Shallow fan service and name recognition were now established as low-effort but nonetheless viable ways to keep this IP profitable. It was also no longer necessary to respect the original source material's creative vision or established continuity. And looking back now, the writing was on the wall that this project bent for the next one to break. Fantastic Beasts was announced in 2013 to a lot of confusion. There was certainly no shortage of in-demand, low-hanging fruit when it came to a potential prequel series, and this was decidedly not one of those. Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, along with its author Newt Scamander, is an in-universe textbook mentioned in one single throwaway line early on in The Sorcerer's Stone. Not the movie, just the book. Scholastic did release a collectible novelty paperback version back in 2001 as part of a charity fundraising effort, but by all accounts, this premise was a deep cut. It also took a lot for granted in terms of how much name recognition was supposed to carry the bulk of the sales pitch for fans to come get invested in a new film series that was so conceptually different than anything we'd ever seen from this world. But, not for the first time, the marketing campaign showed little interest in an approach to under-promise and over-deliver. There was a real concerted effort that tried, if anything too hard, to capitalize on framing this as a real passing of the torch. The newly rebranded Wizarding World franchise wasn't going away or even scaling down, it would just look a little different now. Fantastic Beasts would be a new story for the modern era, on par with the scope and quality of Harry Potter, not just as a one-off, but for the foreseeable future. It was hastily announced that there would be a total of 5 films in the series, a vision that would never come to fruition because after the first 3, they completely canceled the project and stopped making these movies, which is fucking crazy, and we don't talk about it enough. Either way, that cancellation was warranted because these movies were awful. They have their moments, and I do respect anyone involved trying to make the best of what they were given. The first one's fine. I wouldn't go out of my way to call it a bad movie, but that's a far cry from commanding the necessity of 4 sequels. I know the MCU has skewed everyone's perception over the years, but one property getting 5 movies ever, let alone announcing that roadmap ahead of time, is basically unheard of. Harry Potter's original 8 were very much the exception to the rule, especially back then. So that quota of follow-ups carry a nasty chip on their shoulder, probably far too much of one to have ever stood a chance of delivering a product that would have satisfied much of anyone. They're bad, not purely in the way they fail at being good movies. Something about them actually feels cursed. Like they're so weighed down by their own baggage to prove themselves as worthy sequels. You can almost feel the awareness of and insecurity about the fact that this strange, flimsy, and convoluted premise about a zookeeper just doesn't have the sauce to live up to the frankly delusional expectations that were set up for it, but everyone's kind of contractually obligated to just keep pretending it does anyway. It never mattered that they could throw money at the production and marketing, bring David Yates back, and recycle the old music. This story is weird and bloated and tonally all over the place in ways that no individual good performance or number of bright spots could fully compensate for. It's an idea that could honestly have really thrived by dialing back the scope. A lower budget miniseries on HBO could lean into the more lighthearted, whimsical hijinks and save the high stakes world saving to characters who actually belong in that type of conflict. But that idea wouldn't potentially crack $1 billion at the box office, which is basically the only thing studios are interested in. So instead, this series was all but guaranteed to be crushed under the weight of its own overambition, whatever it even ended up being. And they did not know what that was before they were already in over their heads with it. The series has no clue what to do with what it keeps insisting is its own story, charting a new path forward, other than use weird callbacks and fan service to constantly remind you that you're technically watching a Harry Potter movie. But that only made it all the more painfully obvious that mapping the window dressing of Harry Potter's world building onto a new series with so little substance of its own would fail to capture the magic in the same way. The series has none of its own recognizable iconography, doesn't introduce any new and interesting spells. Almost all the characters are hollow and forgettable. There's no sense of place that you could assign any sentimental value to. It's so needlessly allergic to risking an attempt at anything new at all. This was billed as the direct follow-up to a series whose simple creativity allowed its setting alone to become a premier landmark vacation photo and inspire an entire AAA video game. The one whose pop culture significance just kind of accidentally brute forced several dozen words of made-up gibberish into the mainstream lexicon. There's not a single word in my script that the Google Doc doesn't officially recognize. Seriously, look. Fantastic Beasts has nothing like that to show for itself. It's a story so lacking in vision, planning, and creativity that I simply have to believe it was born of an idea no more fully formed than we should make more Harry Potter movies, and a short-sighted overconfidence that they could just make something up along the way. Because it's not even a story, it's two stories, totally incompatible in terms of stakes and tone, fighting for screen time and both losing. The protagonist, playing fast and loose with that term, can't just move his own story forward because he's forced where he doesn't belong into someone else's conflict. But that story, the one they're clearly more interested in telling, can't be what it wants to be either, or at the very least just hurry up and get to the point already because it's stuck inside someone else's movie. So for the second time, this brand finds itself falling out of the good graces of audiences who might want to see what potential could be left in store here. Any attempts to move forward are second-guessed at every turn, and legacy characters shoehorned in to fill the gap have started to feel more and more like cheap fluff. It was no help that multiple cast members were navigating off-screen controversy and making headlines for all the wrong reasons. But, and I do apologize for beating around the bush for this long, of course no one and nothing has done more to tarnish the legacy of Harry Potter than its now intensely controversial author herself.
You're meddling in things that ought not to be meddled in.
J.K. Rowling falls squarely into that genre trope of public figure where essentially everything I've ever learned about her has been against my will. She's usually the type that only gets discussed because people have to, not because they want to, and that absolutely is the case here. Writing fiction can be a deeply personal art form, but it's delivered in a comparatively impersonal product. It's never been a reliable pathway to contemporary fame in the same way that acting or music careers tend to be. The list of people who've ever achieved bona fide celebrity status exclusively through writing fiction, especially within their own lifetime, is very short. Even shorter, seemingly, is the list of people who've ever considered J.K. Rowling to be a particularly interesting person outside the specific context of Harry Potter. I'm not sure what to compare her career to, other than the proverbial one-hit wonder band continuing to tour decades later to an ever-shrinking audience long after it's become apparent that their best work is behind them. Her career is quietly suffering from success in the sense that she has unlimited personal brand recognition from capturing lightning in a bottle once, a long time ago, but to a very publicly embarrassing degree seems fundamentally incapable of building demand for any other creative project with her name attached to it. If I'm being more charitable than she deserves, I can't imagine that's a healthy psychological state for any artistic person to exist in. To that point, after her audience demonstrated they didn't particularly want much of anything from her, it's somewhat unsurprising that she pivoted onto the only other expression that consistently gained her personal attention. J.K. Rowling is not really an author so much as she's an unemployed celebrity billionaire and the de facto figurehead of the TERF or broader anti-transgender movement. Her infamous Twitter account is filled with bigotry, hate speech, dogpiling, and the inflammatory rhetoric that has now come to completely redefine her public image. This pivot has unsurprisingly alienated a lot of her longtime fans and would-be supporters. She doesn't appear to be on good terms with any of the noteworthy actors anymore. Everyone pro-trans distanced themselves from her, so she only ever gets pulled deeper in by her remaining supporters and has started buddying up with some genuinely awful people. It goes beyond unsavory social media posts, too. She has inserted herself into an irresponsible level of political influence here. Yet, unlike so many other problematic entities, apart from her militant transphobia, J.K. Rowling barely holds a material presence in today's world. She isn't an elected official that could simply be voted out by her constituents. She doesn't really make public appearances that anyone might protest. She doesn't own a company in the conventional sense, doesn't sell anything directly, least of all new books. All she's ever done, all she's ever been to the general public, is the lady that made one specific thing. Short of ineffectually blocking or ratioing her tweets, that product seems to be the only avenue for her more passionate critics to channel all of this pushback. And now that she's doubled and tripled down on her viewpoints, refused to concede any ground, or at the very least simply remove herself from the center of attention on these issues like any sane person who's managed to transcend financial incentive would probably do, she's all but forcing our hand. And why not go back without the rose-tinted glasses and dissect some of her past work? Where did any of it come from, and how long has she been like this? More importantly, how did we collectively let her get away with it this long? Surely we must have missed something along the way. It implores us to finally consider the big question. Is Harry Potter bad, actually? No. Still no. That's right, I am dying on this hill. We're absolutely doing this right now. Strap in, everybody. I know, just let me be cringe and sincere and like something basic, unironically, God forbid. I'll take the heat for it, you won't. In all seriousness, this is my tentative, subject to change, best shot at a genuine, appropriately nuanced answer. I'm not gonna actually wear this the whole time, can you imagine? Look, I was 7 in 1999. My friend from down the street who also liked to read books got me into the first 2 from this new series called Harry Potter, and I was immediately hooked. You might have experienced something similar. It happened to a lot of people back around Y2K, but I'll be upfront about the level of addict I'm talking about, okay? I had that fiend in me, dude. I blew through them over and over as a kid. Still remember when Goblet of Fire came out on my birthday. It was the longest book I'd ever read at the time, 734 pages. That's off the dome, by the way. I'm a demon at trivia because of all this. I was obviously familiar with fiction back then, just never realized how words on a page could make imaginary places feel this immersive and whimsical and lived in, how massive character ensembles could feel this lively and three-dimensional, many of whom were around my age and felt as if they were growing up right there alongside me. The story was captivating and inspiring and only got better as it went, so that investment basically continued throughout the whole series run, and I feel like I came away with it with this sense of gratitude for all the adventures and timeless life lessons. It was hands down the most formative piece of entertainment media of my adolescence. Harry Potter meant a lot to me back then, so probably always will. And I'm only this earnest about it, only even bring that up as an acknowledgement that I'm coming into this section from a place of bias. It would be impossible not to, and kind of dishonest to try. That being said, I'd like to think I'm capable of acknowledging and understanding its flaws. There are plenty, and we'll get to them in a second. But even still, when I do my best to try to look at things objectively, I have to admit I find a lot of well-meaning criticism against Harry Potter coming from people who share my beliefs and values to be, for the most part, disappointingly misguided in the grand scheme of things. I'm being pretty complimentary right now, and I'll continue to, but I purposely waited a while to do that because there are many things that this section is not, and I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to name names or try to debunk anyone else's opinion as if this stuff isn't subjective anyway. I'm not gonna invent some pseudo-empirical data like fulfilling character arcs per book or something like that to try to convince you this story is good if you're just not into it for whatever reason. If you've given it an honest chance and don't appreciate or at least understand why it became so beloved, I can't help you there. I'm also not here to tell you that you're wrong if you're no longer willing or able to separate art from artist in this case. I'm not asking anyone to reconsider financially supporting a franchise that will be extravagantly well off with or without your help. I'm not here to claim that there aren't valid, thoughtful criticisms of Harry Potter, or even that examining it more closely for certain hints of the author's eventual villain arc isn't a worthwhile endeavor. But I do think a lot of needless vitriol coming from the more chronically online left, a group that I'm absolutely a part of, full transparency, is time that could be better spent on almost anything else. For one, trying to turn people away who don't already have strong opinions is a mostly lost cause that makes us look even more whiny and insufferable to the outside than we already do. I also have to wonder whether misdirecting too much criticism of Rowling's style of politics toward her decades-old fantasy novels actively trivializes the real-world harm that people who think the way she does are engaged in right now. So let's talk about Harry Potter. There are easy and obvious surface-level criticisms of this story. The rules of Quidditch are game-breakingly stupid, its main character syndrome, the sport, basically anything to do with measurement, population, or the economy at large doesn't really hold up to scrutiny in this universe. Being notoriously bad with numbers is like the one thing she'll actually own up to. Some of the twists are too convoluted to really be believable, looking at you, Triwizard Tournament. There are plot holes regarding a lot of the logistics. Time turners in particular open up a can of worms that the narrative is not equipped to adequately deal with. That type of thing is not unique and just generally unavoidable in a world with the limitless possibilities you're left with by introducing the existence of magic. And when it comes to these, most people are aware and willing to stretch their suspension of disbelief. Prioritizing entertainment value over realism is fine as long as you're doing a mostly good job at it. And while Harry Potter earned a reputation for upholding strong morals and inclusive values, there are also the still relatively obvious criticisms that venture into problematic territory. The Gringotts goblins play into some flagrant anti-Semitic stereotypes. It's arguably more of a movie problem, but this was rough. The leaked placeholder text... the actual printed given name of the only explicitly Asian character is Cho Chang. They were making a lot of money by then. Did she have an editor? Or the racial insensitivities are at best attributable to laziness or ignorance rather than malice, but we can only speculate at the end of the day, and no one's out here really defending them. These were always seen as some unfortunate stains, even on what was otherwise considered a wholesome series. But it's a bad look, and with the impossible to ignore fact that J.K. Rowling sucks now, invites some heavier scrutiny. So then you get to the deeper ideological criticisms, and there's more to unpack there than I have the time or knowledge base to cover exhaustively, though out of fairness I'll try my best to engage with both the overall thesis as well as some of the harsher specifics. When and where the more compelling progressive criticism against Harry Potter comes into play gets political. Specifically, it's often directed at a perceived neutrality towards systemic injustices and the essentialist rhetoric which tends to internally enable or excuse them. Throughout Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling is often quite careless in her willingness to introduce certain social or power dynamics which, if logically extrapolated beyond the immediate circumstance of our protagonists and the narrative scope of their story, carry some disturbing political implications. Whether done intentionally or not, in several instances it's not hard to connect the dots to Rowling's real-world politics of today. For example, through the introduction of house elves in Book 2, this story makes a deliberate choice to conceptually explore an entire race being held in what is unambiguously slavery. Yikes. As soon as the presence of fan-favorite character Dobby can convey the full tragedy at play, he just as quickly reveals another sinister dynamic. House elves aren't just subjugated to enslavement against their will. They actively view it as deserved, even desirable, as an intrinsic feature of their own honor and self-worth. A sentiment that is rarely challenged and even outright defended by many characters who should know better than to offer what comes across to the broader narrative as apologia. So this particular nuance, beyond just creating an additional layer of pity and injustice, raises some difficult questions about the ethical priorities of characters we're otherwise supposed to be rooting for. Why even introduce this type of evil without a clear plan to address and ultimately defeat it by the conclusion? Or at the very least, where is the indignation and outrage? If these characters are the heroes we're supposed to believe that they are, why are they so indifferent to the point of being actively complicit? That's just one example. There are similar issues in the same vein that have been criticized at length. The prison system in this world is a giant human rights violation with non-existent checks and balances in place. School children are needlessly segregated in ways that foster long-standing division and tribalism. And while individual plot points might utilize or even question them in a thematic way, the overall presentation always returns to a certain matter-of-fact acceptance. Non-humans or criminals or Slytherins are what they are and occupy their given space in this world even to the end. Because Harry Potter's conclusion falls victim to the same vacant politics stereotypical in so many other stories with apocalyptic adjacent stakes. There is a common phenomenon in fictional conflict where once the stakes are raised beyond a certain threshold, what universally begins to feel most threatened is nothing short of life as we know it. Within that context, so often these types of conclusions frame a simple return to normalcy as the ultimate victory. And that uncritical celebration of the status quo, particularly when previously addressed systemic injustices or power imbalances are left unresolved, feels conservative. There's really no other word for it. The right team may have won in the end, but not all that much has actually changed for the better. This story was about prejudice and defeating bigoted ideas about blood supremacy. For our main characters, that goal is accomplished, but for several other outside groups, it rings hollow. And politically, that empty lip service feels like a betrayal of its own supposed values in the big picture. So, does that disconnect ruin the message of this story? Does it mean that Harry Potter is bad? No, at the very least not necessarily. I think it is too easy, too misguided and self-congratulatory to go back in hindsight, over-scrutinize some of the more tenuously problematic aspects of these books, miss the forest for the trees as confirmation that J.K. Rowling is evil, and pretend that must mean Harry Potter is and always has been poorly written garbage. What I think is a better approach, a more accurate reflection of the truth, is to recognize that bad people can sometimes create good things. Especially a long time ago, back when they were at their relative best and have demonstrably gotten worse since. There is a lot to be said about gaining power and what that can reveal about a person, but let's not pretend it doesn't also corrupt. She became a billionaire. Those people are freaks. I mean, good lord, are we progressive or not? She had some bad takes and thin skin and only got further radicalized by her new wave of support. In a way, that's the most disappointing part about her downfall. Regardless of some irresponsible choices, she clearly at one point had her heart in the right place with the messaging here, or at least tried to. That doesn't mean she's morally absolved or even an amazing author. It doesn't have to mean anything more than that despite some ignorant or amateurish tendencies, she's got chops, knows how to play to her strengths, and mostly just got lucky with one really solid idea. And fuck J.K. Rowling, seriously, but this story is objectively grounded in altruism and thematically dedicated to the liberation of marginalized people. It deserves some credit for that, even though the internal application of those values is inconsistent and far from perfect when viewed politically. And I feel vindicated saying that, in part because it is not remotely uncommon to hear someone credit this series for shaping or affirming the egalitarian, largely progressive values they hold today, even if it's in a more moderate or apolitical capacity. If you've ever been to something like a themed pop-up bar or live trivia night, it goes without saying that that organized event will be extremely welcoming and inclusive, always LGBT friendly. That's just representative of the community that this series cultivated for itself. And it's hard to believe that's by coincidence, because on the other hand, you never hear about anyone being pushed further right wing because they got too into Harry Potter. It just does not happen. That doesn't mean the problematic undertones aren't there if you go looking, it just means that most readers are capable of keeping things in perspective. Getting too hung up on them seems dependent, at least in part, on a certain disregard for the practicality of is and ought. With storytelling, just like in the real world, there's a disconnect between the way things should be and the way things actually are. Fantasy stories are centered around conflict, they're set in imperfect worlds occupied by flawed characters. Purposely reading too much moral prescriptivism into that type of thing is going to manifest some problematic implications for basically any story. To that point, when a reader is faced with this kind of dialogue, it doesn't come across as a Florida-esque ringing endorsement of slavery being totally fine, actually, but more of an uncomfortable acknowledgement of what's been normalized in this world by characters who would rather not think about it too hard. We can call that problematic, but it's by no means unrealistic. When a vegan in the real world, for example, brings up the cruelty of factory farming, the billions of animals we breed, torture, and kill for our food supply, they don't get their logic or moral philosophy proven wrong, because it isn't. They're right. but they do get thoughtlessly dismissed for being preachy and annoying. It's maybe unintentional, sure, but there is some important commentary to be had there about complacency and cognitive dissonance in relation to the powerlessness of individuals to change entire systems that have been so heavily normalized by society. So where does all of that leave us? Not everything holds up, obviously. We've made some important progress in the past quarter century, and that's a good thing. But there's a lot to like here. This world is charming, these characters are full of heart, the plot is intricate and well crafted. Harry Potter's really good, man. Even the messaging mostly still holds up. I don't claim that to be contrarian. This was the consensus up until pretty recently. To pretend otherwise is revisionist history. And that feels especially hypocritical because it's exactly what the author herself was guilty of back in the much earlier stages of her fall from grace. Before all the transphobia, this is what she was known for. Queerbaiting, constantly wanting credit after the fact for, at the time, riskier details she never chose to bring up until it was socio-politically in vogue to do so. Trying to unconvincingly retcon the weirdest details about stuff. This was a huge meme for a long time, and we don't talk about it anymore. But the parallels there are not exactly a stretch, and I just feel like we can be better than that. Though, admittedly, I'm not about to sit here holding my breath that a reboot will simmer down the discourse. Have you noticed how much harder it's gotten to just enjoy modern entertainment, let alone talk about it? I'd be willing to bet you haven't heard many people quoting the biggest movie of last year, but they wouldn't shut up about which side of the culture war they thought it was on. I have to mention that because this reboot is going to have eyeballs on it, not necessarily in a good way. Plenty of people are not exactly rooting for this thing to succeed for reasons we just covered. In theory, the cretins who still unwaveringly support J.K. Rowling would want to see it do well. Conservatives contribute so little to the arts and entertainment industry and have been cripplingly insecure about it for a long time. The point to keep in mind about that crowd, though, is that they are not in the business of enjoying things. The opportunistic trendsetters in that space know their audience and have one trick up their sleeves. You could call it grievance critique. I've heard it called woke spotting. There's an entire ecosystem of reactionary junk food masquerading as media analysis explicitly designed to farm hate clicks and as an entry point for radicalizing young people into the alt-right. You've probably seen this stuff at a glance. The specific grift is mostly focused on framing strong female characters, minorities, queerness as self-evident rage bait, pearl-clutching hysterics over Hollywood spreading its not-so-secret agenda by appealing to the widest audience possible with overwhelmingly popular ideas. It's not supposed to make sense. Harry Potter has never really held a spotlight in that discourse just because the timelines don't intersect. When it was first blowing up, they tried to bring back good old-fashioned satanic panic the second they heard the word witchcraft. Some of you guys don't remember that, but I was in the trenches, okay? This was a real thing. But we've moved past book burnings and into the current social media landscape, so I feel like it's a safe bet to assume this is going to get ugly. Because reactionaries will go to bat for J.K. Rowling's worst tweets, but they're not going to be able to support Harry Potter to their audiences. It's too on the nose. The story is so explicitly anti-fascist, and the specific cultural commentaries there have actually aged extremely well compared to most anything else. This story has always been woke, whatever the reactionary hive mind wants to pretend that word means any given week. It is not a high bar. And that's just with the original. Who knows what changes might fan the flames? Some of the politics or dialogue might get slightly modernized. What happens if they race swap a main character? There's precedent for it. I'm not saying that's bad or even matters, but the worst people on the internet are going to pretend like it's the fall of Western civilization, just like they always do. This point is necessarily pretty online. You can and should tune these people out. But I only bring up the point that this reboot's going to get a ton of hate from both sides regardless. And that noise is just all the more distracting baggage that this show will have looming over its capacity to just be enjoyed for what it is. Whereas part of me has to believe the original movies got by relatively unscathed because the political climate and internet in general just weren't like this back then.
Honestly, don't you two read?
Side note, I did really want to include these chapters as part of the actual video, but apparently I need a couple hundred more subscribers before YouTube will allow me to use that feature. So if you like this kind of thing, why not just do me a quick favor? Thanks so much. The Harry Potter films are a flawed series. I certainly have my problems with them. At their worst, they really struggle to condense the source material into a feature runtime. Understandably, a lot of the finer detail and character development just gets lost in translation. They have 4 different directors in total. They make some strange artistic choices at times, so they're not always perfect, cohesive, or even particularly faithful adaptations. But they're still good movies. It's actually much easier to talk about their shortcomings because those flaws are so much fewer in number and more specific relative to all the things they do really well. They are, for the most part, character-driven, interestingly written, beautifully shot, and thematically focused. They're just entertaining in that almost intangible way that always made even the most casual of fans want to stop channel surfing or rewatch a marathon over the holidays. A quite evident abundance of care and attention to detail went into this production, from the art direction and practical effects to performances from the supporting cast. The cynic in me knows they could have half-assed much more of these movies all the way to the bank, and I find it admirable that they chose not to. Passionate and talented people went above and beyond to bring these stories to life in a way that respected both the essence of the source material and the craft of filmmaking. In spite of that, they're also very unpretentious, plenty less so than parts of this video. They know what they are and they own it. Family blockbusters. No one was asking for Oscar bait or art house high cinema, and with that in consideration, their success and popularity speaks volumes. These 8 WB originals, every single one of them, are currently still among the top 100 grossing movies of all time. That's annoying, give or take, but whatever. I think it's important not to lose sight of what a mind-blowing accomplishment that is. Not to get all grumpy old man here, but isn't that the approach that movies used to take a lot more often? Make the best art you can and have a little faith that audiences will reward all that hard work financially, not try to optimize profit potential first and then work backward. I don't think that it's just the nostalgia talking to point out that there's something pure and endearing about these movies that just keeps bringing people back to them all these years later. The series is more than the sum of its parts, not something that many people have a standout that they'd consider their favorite movie ever. But as a whole, they still feel so endlessly quotable and irreversibly baked into the public consciousness in ways that some of the other industry giants just never have been. I don't bring any of that up to belabor the obvious point that they left intimidatingly big shoes to fill holistically, but that there is an almost insurmountably high bar for half the individual elements. So many specifics about these movies aren't just done well, they're basically untouchable. During the intro, I brought up the score. Does anyone want that to change? Give me a break. Replacing a lot of these cast members, that just feels like a disservice to everyone involved, past and future. Even the main trio, while never really who I envision as their book counterparts, don't always get enough credit for their contributions. On screen, they're obviously dedicated to this iteration of their characters. Off screen, they clearly had good heads on their shoulders, stayed out of trouble, and despite being some of the most famous people on Earth, never diluted their acting personas or believability in these roles with other high-profile projects. I say that only because casting child actors is hard and risky, especially for character roles they'll primarily be expected to age into over time. That suspension of disbelief for newcomers in big-name roles was also something the original 3 were able to navigate gracefully in a way that I worry might not even be possible anymore. A 10-year commitment just feels like a much bigger ask in the internet age, where they will be subjected to so much industry pressure to both promote the show and transcend their individual part in it by going on Hot Ones and shilling for brand sponsorships on social media even as young teens. Maybe I'm overthinking that, but with changes more relevant to the actual show, what about these locations and set pieces, the school uniforms, the creatures, Hogwarts itself, this animation sequence? Seems like they'll have to make moves there just for the show to be able to market itself as new and different. Visually, I'll even appeal directly to the business side of things. For the past several years, and remaining time up until this reboot launches, revenue for the Harry Potter brand has come, for all intents and purposes, exclusively through the theme parks and merchandising. Absolutely everything about the look and feel of both comes directly from these existing movies that consumers already have deep emotional ties to. Why jeopardize any of that? Would Universal rework the look of the castle, the props, the stores, the integrated cast appearances in the rides? If so, when? I'm sure financially they'd love to double dip and have a newer version of everything to sell moving forward, but do people actually want that enough to pay for it? Alright, so of course, right after I recorded this section, Universal Orlando announced a major expansion to the tune of an entire third park. Epic Universe will open sometime next year and feature 5 brand new themed zones, including the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, Ministry of Magic. Visually, they're not only doubling down on the existing movies instead of planning any wiggle room for the reboot, but also heavily incorporating Fantastic Beasts, a property that the parks had already deliberately removed virtually all references to for obvious reasons. Aesthetically, that's probably the right move in the grand scheme of things, but optically, it's a very strange marketing choice in the meantime. They'll celebrate a failed follow-up spin-off, but then have to ignore any acknowledgement of the iteration of the story that will be actively in production for the first 10 years of this park's life cycle. God, it's like they want to turn this brand into Spider-Man, where the legal copyright is incomprehensibly split between different media conglomerates, each with shared custody like it's some messy divorce. I'm not arguing against the fact that the capabilities of modern-day streaming are, at least on paper, a better fit for faithfully adapting these books than what movies were in the early aughts. But these wildly successful and popular movies do already exist, and we can't pretend that that doesn't completely change the context. If it were, theoretically, another 10 years from now, maybe I'd change my tune, but from what little we know so far, right now, the announcement of HBO Harry Potter can only leave us with more questions than answers.
Why didn't I see it before?
While the end quality of a reboot is right now anyone's guess, what we can expect to see on screen is comparatively very straightforward. This series, its primary characters, iconography, and world building have now been part of the pop culture zeitgeist for the better part of a generation. That's great for the brand, but what presents an additional challenge for this new project is that the basic plot beats are also tantamount to common household knowledge for basically anyone who might consider tuning into this new HBO show. Snape kills Dumbledore isn't exactly the jaw-dropping cliffhanger it was back in 2005. It's a meme, one with none of the novelty or weight behind it that once left fans desperate to find out what happens next back when any of this was still fresh. That's unavoidable, sure, but it is much more of a format break than most people seem to be giving it credit for. I'm hardly the first person to point out that the Harry Potter books, for all they represent quintessential coming-of-age fantasy adventure, are from a genre and structural standpoint mystery novels. They each have their own unique creative flair and distinct subject matter, but there's a pretty basic winning formula here. Through Harry's perspective, we are set up with some suspicious activity or unexplained questions happening mostly in the background. We get clues, insight, and red herrings throughout the school year, but are always missing a few bits of key information until they all culminate in a big interwoven reveal right at the climax. Basic mystery stuff. On paper, this lends itself really well to adaptation on the small screen, where the pacing can better accommodate the subtle mystery elements, and episodes can be divided around the appropriate cliffhangers. But again, I go back to the fact that these plot beats are already basically common knowledge among anyone who'd have any interest in watching this show. I understand that a massive franchise reboot is going to generate a certain amount of curiosity from outsiders, but if you don't already know the basic gists of what happens in this story, there's a good chance you've had to intentionally avoid that information. On the other hand, if you are interested in giving this story a shot for the first time, why would you want to sign up for a years-long commitment instead of just binging what we already have? All of these factors work against the mystery aspect of a Harry Potter reboot 2 decades later holding any of the same gravity it was able to the first time. I also have to consider how rapidly the story grows in complexity past those first couple of entries. There is a lot left on the cutting room floor in those later films, and that's specifically because you're in the full meat of the story that is notably absent when you go back to the first 2 books. Considering that those early Chris Columbus movies are nearly 100% page accurate as is, the advantage that television has as a medium to faithfully adapt the books in their entirety will be mostly a non-factor until several years in. And while I genuinely don't dismiss the appeal in getting to see a 10-hour version of Goblet of Fire in, say, 2030, how many people are actually all that stoked to see a 7-hour version of The Sorcerer's Stone right now? What is the movie we already got missing in that respect? How would you improve upon it in a way that justifies a full series reboot?
Yes, I know.
I've unpacked several points now, and they are admittedly detached from the literal creative process of filmmaking and what's even involved in putting a great adaptation on screen. That hasn't been as much of a focus compared to things like what audiences want or how certain changes from the original movies might be received. That seems a little backward, but I'm willing to give HBO the benefit of the doubt on the more technical side of things. They're a prestige brand with a proven track record and in a position to spare no expense on this project. You have to imagine they will hire a great cinematographer and VFX artists, acting coaches, and marketing teams to make this show feel extravagant, like a real event. But that only goes so far when you're rebooting a series where those features are taken for granted as the baseline expectation that we've all been accustomed to since the VHS era. So I do think audience demand and reception to more surface level changes matters here. Context is everything, and this show will live in the shadow of the original movies until proven otherwise. That's not a death sentence, it's just the reality of the situation. It's a factor that does complicate things, because if HBO can't manage to blow the films out of the water, at least in several key ways, then what was even the point? Something as good as what we already have is an achievable goal here, albeit an ambitious one. The problem is that as good as, in relative context, will feel like a disappointment because it doesn't serve enough of a purpose to justify a full reboot. To that point, the show will be under immense pressure to be a crowd pleaser to as wide an audience as possible. That has me worried, considering the contemporary business model is far too often concerned not so much with just telling a good story, but trying to game the system based on out-of-touch and misguided ideas about what audiences might want. A valid question is who even asked for this, because while I don't think it was anyone in particular, there are several approaches here. Do you cater to that core millennial audience? That strategy backfired on Fantastic Beasts when it tried way too hard to rely on shallow fan service and callbacks that were at best a pointless distraction and at worst actively disrespected and retconned the original source material. Do you try to cater to younger, new outsiders? That's more of a risk, and depending on how much they're willing to alienate the purists, might result in even more changes that people don't really like. Do you coattail ride or pay homage as much as possible to the movies? Plenty of people seem to want stuff like this, which would be horribly distracting to watch. Plus the fact that so many visual elements and creative choices would have to be changed simply for the sake of being different from those movies in ways that would on average skew marginally worse. The strategy they seem to have expressed interest in is creating a more book-accurate adaptation that fans who were disappointed in the original screenplays could be more satisfied with. I'd have to put myself in that camp if I were excited about a reboot, but you know what's already book-accurate? The books! They didn't go anywhere, and there is a limit to how faithfully you even could adapt a novel for the screen before you run into the problems of both bloating your runtime and no longer playing to the strengths of a visual medium. It's never that simple. Screenwriters exist for a reason. All that to say, there are more than enough factors at play to present this show with an identity crisis. It happened to Fantastic Beasts, it could happen here too. There are countless other factors which feel as if they cumulatively guarantee a ceiling for what this show will or even could be. Slightly better than the movies in some ways, slightly worse in other ways, and leaving everything else just different enough so that the show can justify its own existence. Being good is not the same thing as being different, but neither of those things are the same as being both. I'd be happy to revisit this and eat my words, but the more I think about it, given the downward trend in the state of the franchise, the worst thing this show could be, mid or just pretty good, might be the only thing the show can be. And for the average viewer, that probably wouldn't feel like it was worth it. It would feel as if the vision for the show was a failure, as if, not too unlike the author herself, it became part of the problem it seemed to want to solve. And there's something really uncanny about that, some intangible departure from the spirit of Harry Potter that's worth talking about.
I'm ready to die.
I can't help but call attention to a serendipitous interval between the year 2007, the end of Harry Potter's original publication run, and this reboot's slated release date of 2026, 19 years later, the verbatim title of the series epilogue. Quote, "All was well" bookends this story for its final time, after just 7 pages into a brief vignette of what amounts to Happily Ever After. A sequence that invites mild controversy to this day for what some criticize as being overly idealistic. I'm generally fine with the corny epilogue for what it is. Appreciate that it ties up some loose ends from an otherwise abrupt conclusion that could have only been drawn out in a much more bittersweet and anticlimactic fashion without the significant time jump. But it is too naive, too overly idealistic to want my preferred, uncomplicated send-off for this story and its legacy. That ship has sailed. The closing words of Chapter 36, The Flaw in the Plan, the final chapter of both Deathly Hallows proper and the series overall, is an excerpt of Harry's dialogue. "I've had enough trouble for a lifetime." That sentiment is a reflection of where we're actually at, with the complicated legacy of this story and what it means right now to a lot of torn people. I can't predict the future, don't know what will happen with this reboot, but I do know that I don't like what it represents. A core theme throughout the Harry Potter series is death, both the importance of and meaning behind what it is to embrace your own mortality. This is facilitated not just in the recurring motif of self-sacrifice, but by proxy of consequence. Voldemort, in his ill-advised pursuit of immortality, wrenches mangled fragments of his own soul into Horcruxes. When he finally meets his end, what remains is eternally trapped in the purgatory of limbo between this life and what lies beyond, whatever that means to you, the reader. The Mirror of Erised and Resurrection Stone showed how this transition is a one-way path that can't happen in reverse. Perhaps most poetically appropriate is the representation of ghosts in this universe as members of the Wizarding Dead, who by cowardice or greed chose to forever remain behind in an ethereal form that is simultaneously an aesthetically recognizable avatar and an ultimately empty, lifeless imitation of their past existence. In each case, the narrative asserts with no ambiguity that there is a correct choice and that this is not it. You're supposed to let go, supposed to move on. I don't want Harry Potter to die so much as I want it to finally be allowed to rest in peace. I have no interest in this story being relegated to a pawn in the discourse, the culture war. And I sure as hell don't want to see pure greed puppeteering its lifeless form around in a state that can no longer rightfully claim any of the heart and soul it was able to deliver while in its prime. Harry Potter, for any of its faults, was a triumph of storytelling, from a time when the world felt a lot simpler. It's over now, though, and that's okay. We can and probably should move on, but the unfortunate reality is that money always wins. If not for these exact business trends, we could take all of the resources afforded to this project and spend them on a new creative idea that deserves a shot at becoming the next Harry Potter, but will probably never see the light of day. That disconnect between the real spirit of Harry Potter and the real-world powers that be is more than anything the root of why I worry this whole thing could be a mistake. Still probably gonna watch it though. God, that's how they get you every time. I'm glad I didn't burn myself at least.